Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Shabbat Shalom.
So today, as part of the section of Torah that Bryn is going to read, she's actually going to read some verses that are probably some of the most famous ideas in law in the history of the world. In the history of the world. And so much so that we don't find it just in the Judeo-Christian world coming from the Torah, but we find it in other parts of the world as well. Anybody know what it is that I may be talking about? What would you guess would be one of the most famous ideas of law in the world? Michal? Go ahead. Witnesses, I like that. Perhaps the need to have witnesses, that is really super important within Jewish law. Not necessarily everybody's law, by the way. But no, it's an important piece, but it's not what we're talking about today. Any lawyers here? Anybody admitting? No? So the Latin of this is called lex talionis, right? Which basically is an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Right? An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Right? Right. He agrees. So we see this, we're going to read it in our Torah in a moment, but we see this actually going all the way back to the Code of Hammurabi, one of the earliest codes of law, right, which was written somewhere between 1792 and 1750 BCE, right? Law number 196, if a man puts out the eye of another man, his eye shall be put out. If he breaks another man's bone, his bone shall be broken. If he puts out the eye of a freedman or break the bone of a freedman, he shall pay 1 gold mina, etc., etc., etc. If he knocks out the teeth, he shall pay, right? So this idea of an eye for an eye, it's very famous. And we also have that within our Torah. Twice, actually, once in Exodus and once in this week's Parsha that Bryn is going to read. So if you turn to page 733 in your Chumashim, I'll actually start the very last line of 732. If anyone kills any human being, he shall be put to death. One who kills a beast shall make restitution for it, life for life. If anyone maims his fellow, as he has done, so shall it be done to him, fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. The injury he inflicted on another shall be inflicted on him. Okay. So we've established that all the way back to the Code of Hammurabi, this was there. We've established this in our Torah. What's the problem? What's the problem with lex talionis? What's the problem with this law? Brett?
Some things aren't, it's not always eye for an eye.
You can't always be equal, right? You can't always be equal. Maybe, by the way, somebody takes out a person's eye, maybe they don't have another eye, right? Maybe they don't have their own eye. So now what do? You can't always set it up so that these things are equal with one another. Good. What else? What else is the problem with this law? Not just in a legal, but maybe a moral, theological, philosophical way as well. Michal? So it doesn't distinguish between purposeful and accidental. And by the way, I think back in the time of the Code of Hammurabi, certainly there was no distinction there. It is what it is, right? But yeah, is there a distinction between the fact that you purposely poked out someone's eye, or you just happen to be, waving your hands in celebration and it hits somebody in the eye and it damages them? Okay. Vard. Good. So Varda's coming at this from the opposite direction, and I agree with you, by the way, and we're going to get to that. This is actually pretty radical and revolutionary, right? To say that my eye, it doesn't say that a person's eye, with the exception of a slave or a freed person, right? That is going to be a difference here. But my eye and your eye are basically worth the same thing. The president's eye and my eye are worth the same thing, right? So it actually equalizes everybody in some ways. It equalizes in some ways. But we still struggle with if this is to be taken literally, and that's the question, right? You don't know if it's to be taken literally or not. We struggle with this, yeah? Anti-collective punishment. What do you mean by that, Michal?
Well, that because it's the one-to-one ratio, that somebody can't, because somebody in their family has been killed, go ahead and wipe out the village.
Oh.
The person who did the killing.
It actually, okay. I think we're actually honing in on some important pieces here. It doesn't allow for revenge to take an impact in this, right? To say, well, he knocked out my eye. I'm angry with him. I'm going to kill him because I'm angry with him. So it kind of, in a very brutal and straightforward way, equates the punishments. It's saying the punishment needs to fit the crime, right? Now, it makes us uncomfortable, I think, because of the physical nature of it, but the punishment needs to fit the crime. Yeah? Does it take into account if it's defensive? Not in this place, but in other places, right, where it does allow for self-defense. So that would overrule or override this, potentially. So one of the best formulations of the problem of this comes from none other than Tevye in Fiddler on the Roof, right? And he formulates it so well. A villager at one point in time in Fiddler on the Roof says, an eye for an eye, right? A tooth for a tooth. And Tevye's response is, very good, that way the whole world will be blind and toothless. Right? What's Tevye trying to get at with the problem potentially with this? It doesn't make the world better. It doesn't make the world a better place. And to some degree, right? To some degree, and I know there's at least one lawyer sitting in here. You can disagree with me if you want, right? To some degree, that's what justice is supposed to do. Yes, they're supposed to create fairness and equity, but overall, we yearn for a system of justice because it's supposed to make the world a better place. And yet, if at the end of justice, the world, as Tevye says, is eyeless and toothless, is that really the world that we want to live in? Right? Is that the ideal? So, what do we do with this? Because the Torah very clearly says, an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Bryn is going to read it. We're going to listen to Bryn, right? We're going to listen to her. That's what she says. So what's the rabbinic response? What's the Jewish response to how we understand this particular text?
That you have to do something to equalize, so that if you take out someone's eye, you can walk them around.
So you have to do something to equalize, right? You have to do something. It's not a literal eye for an eye, but it's maybe monetary compensation, right? It's doing something to help mitigate the damage that was done, to undo the damage that was done. Okay, if you can. Michal? You were going to say the same thing. Anybody else? So that is the rabbinic response to this is to say we don't understand it literally, an eye for an eye, but we understand it as the value of an eye, right? That if we've taken away that eye, we have to replace the value of what that eye is. And by the way, it's not just a physical value. Maybe if that person can't work anymore, right? Maybe if we cut off their hand, even by mistake or intentionally, and they were a concert pianist, we now have to replace the value of what it is that that person was going to make. So it's not just the value of a particular organ. And by the way, the rabbis had no problems doing that, right? They created sort of, in the same way we do in today's day and age, guidelines for if this person is damaged in this way, this is sort of the realm of what those damages are worth, right? To try and keep it fair. So the rabbis are really struggling with how do we make this work. Sforno Sadia Gaon says it, it's kind of what Brent was saying earlier. He wants to come up. He wants to be a rabbi. I think so. He's like, I want to give the sermon today. All right. So Sadia Gaon says, we cannot explain this verse literally. For if a man struck the eye of his fellow and caused a vision loss equal to 1/3. So I hit somebody in the eye and they lose 1/3 of their vision. How am I going to be able to strike a blow that is going to damage this other person just 1/3 of their vision? It's impossible. Therefore, it has to be monetary compensation. And the Mishnah comes in and expands on that and says one who injures his fellow is liable concerning him for 5 different categories of payment. 5 different categories of payment. Damages, pain, health care, got to pay for the doctors, unemployment, and shame. By shame, it means that emotional damage that it's going to do. 5 different ways. So it has taken an eye for an eye and actually expanded it into something much larger than it would have been. But the idea behind this goes back to, instead of, as Tevye said, a world filled with toothless, eyeless people, we say, if I do something to my fellow human being, intentionally or not intentionally, there are consequences and repercussions. And we have to live to that. That's what makes the world a better place. It's not about revenge, it's about accepting the consequences for our actions. And from a Jewish perspective, understanding the consequences and accepting consequences of what we do, both for the good and for the bad, are fundamental parts of who we are. The last thing that I want to say about this is, for those of you who've been paying attention these last few weeks, as we've been reading in the book of Leviticus, this is kind of an out-of-place conversation. We have been knee-deep in ritual law. That's what the book of Leviticus is mostly about. Ritual law. We do have some law that deals with how we treat one another, right, in Kedoshim, but then we dive back into ritual law. So in the midst of Emor, that is very heavily ritual, we're going to talk about it a little bit later. We talk about the fact that this is one of the places that mentions all the holidays and how we observe the holidays. What is this doing here? What is this doing here? And Rabbi Sachs has a really interesting understanding of this, and this is what I want to leave you with. Why do we have a conversation that is moral, right, in the midst of all of this ritual law? And Rabbi Sachs argues that ritual behavior leads to social behavior. From a Jewish perspective, why do we do all of these things? Right? Why do we light Shabbat candles, and why do we make it such a point to check the box for all of these mitzvot? Yes, to some degree it's because that's what God said, so that's what we're going to do. but it is a large program of sort of behavior modification, right? Of shaping behavior by the way in which we live our lives. And that leads us to think in a moral and ethical way. So as we're dealing with all of these rituals, as we're dealing with all of these things that seem like, do they really make any sense for us today? Our Torah text reminds us that actually these rules, these laws that we have, are there not just to shape ourselves personally, but to shape our society into something, in a place that we want to live, into that ideal that it can be, even if it's not always that way. And to remind us that the way in which we treat one another is sometimes even more important than the way in which we treat God. Any comments before we get into our Torah reading for today? Yeah, Neil.
Must have been a struggle to convert those very blunt, very somewhat violent acts into what we just discussed.
Yeah, Neil is saying it must have been a struggle to sort of convert that. And I think the struggle is going to be to satiate the need for revenge, the anger piece, right? And that was difficult because before this, if you hurt somebody, then their family was going to come and hurt you. And that's where the Hatfields and the McCoys, right? Why did that keep going and going and going? Well, this one did this, and then this one did a little bit more, and that one did a little bit more, and that one did a little bit more, and then you have this feud that lasts for centuries or for decades, whatever it may be. So to be able to take a step back from that, release that emotionality and say, there needs to be a way to make this right, but it needs to be done in a way that makes society better as opposed to just you feel better. That's a powerful chiddush, as we say. It's a powerful new idea that didn't necessarily exist before this. Anything else? All right, Shabbat Shalom, everyone.